Snow clung to the edges of the Vermont cabin as Emma stepped inside, brushing cold air from her coat. She expected warmth, peace, maybe laughter from old friends. Instead, the moment she crossed the doorway, she felt something shift in invisible pull, a quiet tension that came from emotions she thought she had buried months ago. The weekend was supposed to be simple. She and Daniel needed a break from the constant back and forth of normal life. And their friends Mark and Lila had invited them for a quiet getaway. A chance to breathe, reconnect, remember who they used to be. But even before the first cup of cocoa touched her hands, Emma sensed the trip would be different. Too different. Mark greeted her with his usual enthusiasm. His smile wide and warm, but his eyes carried something else: curiosity, maybe even concern. Lila hugged her next, long and soft, the kind of hug that made Emma feel both comforted and exposed. Behind them, Daniel carried the bags. Quiet, focused. Acting like everything was normal, even though Emma knew he had been distant for months. Something was missing between them. No fights, no dramatic moments. Just fatigue where there used to be passion. Silence where there used to be connection. They were all gathered in the living room before Emma even had time to settle in. The fire crackled in the large stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and golden light. It should have been comforting. It should have felt like home. Instead, the space felt too intimate, too honest, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her to say something she had not yet admitted out loud. Lila sat close beside her on the couch, studying Emma's face with unusual attention. "You look tired," she said softly. "Is everything okay?" Emma forced a smile. Just work. Just life. But the answer didn't satisfy Lila. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Emma and the fire could hear. "I saw the way Daniel looked at you earlier," she said. "You two still have that spark. I miss seeing that kind of love." The words hit Emma like cold water, not because they were offensive or strange, but because they cut through her carefully held control. She wasn't used to someone noticing the details, the small looks, the quiet moments, the tiny pieces of affection that had been disappearing slowly over time. Daniel had looked at her earlier, yes, longer than usual, almost searching. She ignored it at the time, too afraid to hope it meant something. Before Emma could respond, Mark, sitting across from them, spoke with a half-joking tone but a completely serious expression. "Honestly," he said, "we'd love to see you to reconnect while you're here. It's rare these days to see people still look at each other like that." Daniel stopped unpacking. He turned toward the group and then toward Emma. His eyes were soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he had permission to feel something in front of others. Emma felt the heat rise in her face, not embarrassment, not shame, but something tender and raw. She hadn't expected their friends to speak so openly. She hadn't expected to feel this exposed. The room fell into a surprising silence, not awkward, but meaningful. Emma felt the weight of 4 lives sitting in that quiet, all of them holding unspoken stories, unspoken longings. Daniel walked over and sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth from his shoulder. He reached for her hand, slow and careful, the way he used to before life grew heavy. His touch was undramatic. It wasn't bold. It was gentle, cautious, as if he was asking her for permission to try again. And in that moment, Mark and Lila watched, not in a strange way, not with anything inappropriate, but with the soft, longing gaze of people who had once had something beautiful and wanted to feel it again. Their eyes weren't hungry. They weren't filled with desire. They were filled with nostalgia, with admiration for a connection that still flickered even when Emma thought it was gone. Something inside her loosened. For months, she had felt the distance between herself and Daniel growing, a slow, quiet ache she didn't know how to fix. She thought he didn't notice. She thought he didn't feel the same emptiness. But here he was, touching her hand with a gentleness she hadn't felt in so long. And here were their friends, noticing what Emma couldn't say out loud. Daniel's thumb brushed hers. Emma didn't pull away. Lila's voice broke the silence, soft and almost emotional. "It's beautiful," she said. To see two people finding their way back. Emma looked at her, surprised. Finding our way back. She repeated quietly. Lila nodded. Marriage is hard. But when we saw you two walk in today, the way you stood next to each other, the way he watched you, we could tell something was still there. Emma swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say, but Daniel spoke instead. We've been distant, he said simply. Not angry, just tired. We needed this trip more than we thought. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Everyone needs to feel seen, he said. Sometimes it takes friends to remind us what we still have. Emma felt her chest tighten. Being seen was the last thing she expected today. She had spent months hiding her loneliness, pretending nothing had changed. But now that the truth was out, the room didn't feel suffocating. It felt honest. And that honesty made her realize how much she missed Daniel. Not the version he became when things got busy, but the man she married, the man who looked at her the way he did earlier. With warmth and longing and a little bit of fear, the four of them spent the next hour talking. Not about dramatic confessions or painful arguments, but about life. Simple things. Funny memories. Moments they had forgotten. Yet beneath the conversation ran a quiet current of emotion, a shared understanding that relationships weren't perfect, that everyone in the room was carrying their own hidden struggles. Lila and Mark shared stories about their own disconnects, their own quiet moments of drifting, and Emma realized something important. She wasn't alone. None of them were. Every couple goes through seasons. Every marriage loses its spark now and then. What matters is whether the spark can be found again at one point. Daniel placed his hand lightly on her knee, almost absent-mindedly, and Lila smiled with gentle approval, as if saying, "There it is. That's what we meant." Emma felt a strange warmth fill her chest. She didn't feel judged. She didn't feel pressured. She felt supported, almost held not physically, but emotionally by people who cared about her, who loved seeing her rediscover what she thought she was losing later. When they all stood to prepare dinner, Daniel touched her wrist softly. "You okay?" he asked. Emma nodded. "Are you?" His eyes softened. "I think I'm finally trying to be." Something deep inside her trembled hope, fear, longing. It had been so long since she heard that kind of honesty in his voice as the snow thickened outside and the cabin lights glowed warmly. Emma felt the smallest flicker of something she thought was lost. Not passion. Not romance. Something quieter. Possibility. She didn't know where this weekend would lead. She didn't know if the spark could fully come back. She didn't know what Mark and Lila had seen that she couldn't. But she knew one thing. Something inside her marriage had moved tonight. And it wasn't going to stop there. Because in a few hours, without planning it, without expecting, Ichi and Daniel would end up sharing a moment that would change everything. A moment they didn't hide. A moment their friends quietly witnessed. A moment that made Emma realize that sometimes, before love can return, someone else has to see it first. And the night was far from over. The morning light filtered softly through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin in shades of gold and silver. Emma stirred in the bed, the warmth of the blankets failing to match the warmth she felt in her chest. Last night had changed everything. The gentle touch of Daniel's hand on hers, the quiet smiles from Mark and Lila. The feeling of being truly seen it. All lingered in her mind, persistent and comforting. She lay still for a moment, listening to the faint sound of snow brushing against the windows, letting herself savor the rare sense of calm she hadn't felt in months. Daniel entered the room, carrying a mug of steaming coffee, his hair tousled from sleep. He gave her a small, shy smile. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. He handed her the mug, and their fingers brushed once more. Emma felt a spark, tiny, fleeting, but real, and she realized how starved she had been for simple connection. They hadn't had this kind of closeness in a long time. "Morning," she replied, trying not to let the flutter in her chest show. She wanted to capture this moment and hold it forever. The air between them was gentle, yet charged with something unspoken. Downstairs, the aroma of pancakes and coffee filled the kitchen. Mark and Lila were already there, moving around easily, laughing quietly as they set the table. Lila's eyes met Emma's briefly, and she smiled, a knowing, quiet smile, as if acknowledging the night before without saying a word. Mark handed Daniel a plate and nodded toward Emma. "You two really seem different this morning," Kay said, half teasing, half observing. Daniel shrugged, but Emma noticed the slight smile tugging at his lips. "Different isn't bad," he said softly. The four of them settled around the table, plates piled with pancakes and fruit. Conversation flowed easily about the snow outside, memories from past trips, and the little absurdities of everyday life. But beneath the light chatter, there was an undercurrent, a quiet energy. Emma could feel it. Daniel could feel it. And even Mark and Lila seemed to sense it. Though they didn't comment directly, after breakfast, they decided to walk through the snow-covered woods near the cabin. The cold air was crisp, refreshing, and it felt good to move after sitting inside. Emma pulled her scarf tighter and glanced at Daniel. He walked slightly ahead, but every so often he would look back, making sure she was okay. Their hands brushed accidentally, intentionally, and she caught his glance. That look, the one from last night, was back, and it was stronger. It carried history, longing, and the promise of something new. Mark and Lila walked a few steps ahead, chatting, but Emma noticed them glancing back now and then. Their expressions soft, almost wistful. They weren't watching for anything improper. They were watching for the quiet moments, the subtle gestures that revealed intimacy, trust, and the depth of connection between two people. Emma felt an unexpected thrill. It was strange to be observed like this, yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like having witnesses to a fragile beauty that had almost been forgotten. Daniel squeezed her hand briefly, and Emma responded instinctively, their fingers interlacing more firmly. They reached a clearing where the snow was untouched, sparkling under the pale morning sun. Daniel paused, turning to face her. He brushed snow from her shoulder, then let his hand linger near hers. The moment was unspoken but electric. No words were needed. Emma could feel the tension of months melting, replaced by something tender and honest. "I miss this," Daniel said quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. "Missed us." Emma's heart ached at the simplicity of his words. "Me too," she admitted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was true, and that truth mattered more than anything. Mark and Lila had stopped a few feet away, pretending to adjust their scarves, but Emma noticed the soft smiles on their faces. They weren't intruding. They weren't judging. They were appreciating what was happening. The way two people could reconnect slowly, carefully, intentionally, and still hold space for others to witness it. The four of them walked back to the cabin, the snow crunching beneath their boots, and when they reached the porch, Daniel held the door open for Emma. Their fingers brushed again, and she felt a warmth that had been missing for months. Inside, the afternoon passed in quiet comfort. They played board games, prepared simple meals together, and shared stories. But every now and then, their hands would touch, a knee would brush against another, a gaze would linger. And each time, Emma felt the tiny thrill of rediscovery. It wasn't passionate. It wasn't hurried. It was careful, deliberate, and entirely real. Later, as the sky darkened and the fireplace cast a warm glow over the room, Lila spoke softly. "You know," she said, "most people stop showing affection after a few years. But you too. It's different. It's brave." Emma blinked. Brave. She had never thought of her marriage in those terms. She thought of it as tired, routine, fading. But Mark and Lila's words made her reconsider. Maybe bravery wasn't loud. Maybe it wasn't about grand gestures. Maybe bravery was in the small, quiet choices to reach for each other, even when life had grown complicated. Daniel squeezed her hand again. "Maybe we needed someone else to remind us," he whispered. Emma nodded. It made sense. Seeing their friends observe them quietly, gently, without judgment, allowed her to feel their love as if it were being reflected back at her. The recognition, the acknowledgement of their connection, gave it weight. It gave it meaning. As evening came, the cabin felt smaller and warmer, a cocoon for the four of them. Emma and Daniel sat together, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing. Mark and Lila moved about, preparing a simple dinner, occasionally glancing their way with soft smiles. It wasn't intrusive. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was human. Witnessing love in its simplest, most honest form. After dinner, the friends gathered around the fireplace again. Conversation flowed soft and easy, but the air was charged with quiet emotion. Emma could feel the pull of Daniel's hand, the familiar comfort of his presence, the silent promises of reconnection. She realized that last night's moment wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something they had almost lost. Later, when the room was quiet and Mark and Lila excused themselves to their room, Daniel turned to Emma, his eyes serious but gentle. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "Them noticing us?" Emma shook her head, surprised by her own certainty. "No," she said. "It feels right. Somehow, having them see us reminds me of what we have." Daniel exhaled, relief flooding his expression. "I was afraid. Afraid that noticing would make it awkward, uncomfortable, but it doesn't. Not with you." Emma smiled. The words were simple, but they carried everything she had been feeling for months. Tiredness, longing, hope, and the fragile thrill of reconnecting. The night settled around them, quiet and peaceful, with snow softly falling outside. Emma felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. The warmth of the fire, the presence of friends, the closeness of her husband, it all blended into something she could almost hold in her hands. And yet, there was more than comfort. There was a subtle thrill, a recognition that love was not something static, not something guaranteed. It required effort, attention, and sometimes witnesses. People who could remind them of what they were fighting for. Watching didn't mean intruding. Watching didn't mean judging. Watching meant honoring the quiet moments, the small gestures. The fragile reconnection of hearts. Emma rested her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder. He held her with care, not urgency, not heat, but steady, intentional closeness. Their breathing synchronized. The quiet crackle of the fire filled the spaces where words were unnecessary. For Emma, this was a revelation. Love was not always about grand moments. Sometimes it was about being seen while simply existing together. Allowing someone else to witness the small but profound intimacy of everyday affection. Upstairs, she could hear the faint laughter of Mark and Lila, soft, tentative, carrying a hint of wistfulness. Emma smiled, knowing they weren't laughing at her or Daniel. They were laughing with them. They were appreciating the beauty of connection, the courage it took to keep trying. And Emma realized that the act of letting someone quietly watch had strengthened her own courage. The weekend passed quickly after that. Walks in the snow, shared meals. Quiet evenings by the fire, they all felt like chapters of a story unfolding, a story Emma hadn't been sure could continue. But each small interaction, each lingering touch, each smile shared in the presence of their friends reinforced what she had already begun to understand. Love could return. Quietly, carefully, bravely. Even after it seemed to fade, by the time they were ready to leave, Emma felt a sense of clarity. The cabin, the snow, the fire, the quiet observation of friends, it had all served as a mirror. A reflection not of perfection, but of truth. Her marriage with Daniel wasn't broken. It had been sleeping, waiting, and now, finally, it was waking. Daniel squeezed her hand one last time before they stepped into the cold morning air, their fingers entwined. "Thank you," he whispered. Emma smiled, warmth spreading in her chest. "For what?" "For trying. For being here. For letting them see us." And she knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes love needed witnesses, not for validation, not for performance, but for the quiet affirmation that what existed between two people was real, worth fighting for, worth holding on to. As they drove away from the cabin, snowflakes drifting lazily around the windshield, Emma glanced at Daniel, their hands still entwined.